Just a few days ago, we were watching a television show that was set in the early 1980s, and one of the characters was working away at a desktop computer, and it sparked some memories for me that I thought I'd like to share, in part because they were pretty pleasant memories, and they're kind of cool, and I think people could probably either derive something from them or relate to them. And so this is really about something that my dad and I shared over the course of a winter going into spring when we took a computer class together. And, the computers back then were these big solid desktop models where the monitor, which was usually green and black, there wasn't any color at that time, at least for most types of computers. It was like one solid case, and the motherboard and all the other stuff was inside of it. Back then they were just starting to come out with floppy disks, but the ones that we had actually used tape cassettes for recording things. Like the old cassettes, not the reel-to-reel, but the ones that you would pop into a boombox, and so they could kind of do double duty for that. And when I was in elementary school, and I finished elementary school in 1980, it wasn't a secret room, but it was very hard to find. You had to know where to go. And it had, I think, 2 or 3 Commodore computers in it. And they were these things, the screen was about this big, and you had to enter everything in with DOS. You had to type in your programs. You could record something and then, upload that into the computer. And I had a friend, Keith Sikora, who knew about computers. I didn't really know about computers at that time. Although, we'd see him in the sci-fi movies and TV shows and things like that, right? Like in Buck Rogers or, Star Wars. So in any case, I remember a lunch period where Keith was like, I want to show you this thing. So instead of going out and playing at recess, we go into this computer room and he's typing away furiously. And it was a program that made a bunch of stars, and we thought that was so cool, right? It was kind of mind-blowing for us. And so, I thought computers were kind of neat. I didn't know how Keith knew about this or anything like that. And at University Lake School, which is where I went for middle school, it was a private middle school. And I've told some stories about that already. I'll probably tell many more. Suffice it to say, it was pretty exclusive. It had a massive campus, very small student body, a lot of teachers who probably should not have been teaching, some who were really great. And it was the kind of place that you were either rich or you were smart, and there was very little overlap between the two. I was there on scholarship. That's how my parents could afford to send me there, as were several other kids who I became friends with. And ULS had not exactly a computer lab as such, but in at least a few of the rooms, there were like banks of computers. And you could sit down and work at them. But you actually had to have permission because they didn't want just anybody going to town on them. And I think if I remember right, you'd have to sign up for computer time, and some of them had the capacity to use the tapes. Some of them didn't. They were different types of Commodore computers. I remember there was the PET, and there were some others as well. And I'm not sure who came up with the idea, but University Lake School had a class that was not just for kids, but for kids and their parents to learn about computers. I guess they saw it as the wave of the future, which they were correct about. And so my dad found out about this, and he said, it was in the fall. He's like, "Do you want to sign up for this class?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds cool." And he said, "Well, I'll sign up for it too. I want to learn how to use computers as well. It'd be really handy." So it started in the spring semester. So it started in the middle of winter. And I don't remember how many sessions there were. Maybe it was 8 or so. But every Saturday for a while, we would, make the drive in to school. And he and I would, park the car and walk to the main building and go in there, and there'd be somebody, and I don't know if they actually worked for ULS or if they were somebody else coming in from the outside, but we would get these classes and, sit down and tippy type the things into the computer. Some of us were very slow typists. My dad actually was a pretty quick typist. And, we learned the basics of what computers were about and, what were the different components and what could you do and what couldn't you do. And there was a book that we checked out from the library, I remember, and it had all these programs in it, these DOS programs that had, all these lines, and then it would tell you what the program did. And I remember reading through it and getting kind of excited about it. And my dad and I are looking through it and being like, well, that's kind of a cool program. Maybe we'll have to see if we can program that in next time that we get a chance. And it never actually happened like that, except for with some of the very short programs, because some of the programs would be page after page after page. This was a time, too, by the way, when there were magazines that you could buy that had all sorts of, long DOS programs in them, as well as, all sorts of other computer-related things that were quite cool. So it was like this new world that was opening up. And, I was like, so 1981, I was 10 years old, going to be 11 in August. And my dad would have been about 35. His birthday was in January. And so it was something that we were doing together. And I'll mention this too as well, that my dad was a very hard worker. He actually was a tax attorney. He had earned a law degree and passed his CPA. And, he did a lot of stuff here in downtown Milwaukee. Actually, we're just a few blocks from where he used to work. And then he changed jobs so he could be closer to us and not be totally gone during tax season, working as the chief accountant for a place that, as it turned out, they wanted him to cook the books. Whole different story. So he ended up having to leave there. But, when he had time, when he was home on the weekends or at night and all that, he really was engaged. I mean, we did all sorts of camping, and we had a boat, we'd go fishing. He took an interest in what we were doing, as did my mom. So doing this class together was not something really that unusual, but it's something that I really do remember from our time together. And unfortunately, as I think many of you know, my dad died in 1982 when I was 11, shortly before my birthday, August 2nd. And he was only 36 at the time. We were actually supposed to be going down to Houston, Texas. He'd started working for Touche Ross again, and they wanted him to open up an office down there, so we were all ready to move. So this would be like the winter before that year when he died, and I don't think he had any inkling that was going to happen, and we certainly didn't either. So this was like something that he and I were doing together to prepare for a future that would include a lot of computers, and I learned a lot in that class. I'm not sure what he learned because I don't remember talking that much about it. I think he just wanted to actually do it with me as something that we would have fun with, and then maybe he'd apply it later on. And, I learned the rudiments of DOS programming. I learned a lot of commands and how to understand, how these things would line up. And so it became part of my repertoire. And, while I was at ULS, we would swap programs here and there. People had written programs, and, you would record it onto, first you'd load it up to the computer, then you'd load it onto your cassette tape that you'd carry around, which you used for all of your data. And it was all just games kind of stuff. There was one program in there that I thought was really quite cool, which was called ELIZA, and it was, this is in that book that I was talking about, it was supposed to replicate a psychotherapist, and it was, the very beginning of a certain kind of AI, not a real AI, of course, but you see ELIZA showing up in cyberpunk novels later on in the 90s, like William Gibson and other thinkers. And I always wanted to try to program that in, but it was very long, and I didn't have the time to do that. So, we would putter around with the computers. They got better. Unfortunately, my dad, like I said, died before we could really reap many of the benefits of that. But I carried it forward. I remember like going over to people's houses and, they would show off the computer that they had because that became like a prestige thing to have. And there were like all sorts of levels to it. If you had a Commodore 64, that was, kind of a blue collar working class to middle class kind of thing. The people who had the really expensive would cost you over $1,000 computers. That was, the rich people. Then you had, the Tandy computers in the middle. You had like the ZX80 at the very bottom level and everything in between. And, DOS wasn't exactly the same in every single system, but it was similar enough that you'd like go over to somebody's house and then you start monkeying around with their computer. And they were usually pretty cool with it. They'd be like, wow, that kid actually knows how to program. My kids, that we bought this for them and they're not interested in it at all. And I was really into adventure games and I wanted to create something like Zorg, and so we'd be at somebody's house and I'd be working away at it. And then of course it was all for naught because, any complex game, your program, you're not going to have the time to fully develop it. You're not saving it either. So, and then, by the time that I was in high school and we did get a Commodore 64, we mostly used it for playing games, a bit of word processing. But I went to school in college, and my sophomore year, I got a computer that my friend put together for me, and it was still everything was all DOS, but things were starting to come out that were a lot more complex. And so that class that I took with my dad, that he wanted to sign up for, I think not, maybe because he wanted to do something with computers, but more he just wanted to hang out with his kid, turned out to be very useful. It's not that I do anything with DOS today. Nobody really does, right? But it proved to be something very helpful for me for over a decade. And it was a really nice thing that he did. I remember, I have memories of like walking down the halls with him and driving out there and driving back and sitting by our fireplace in the living room and like pouring through this book of programs and talking about how cool it would be if we were to program this in. So, sometimes when I see ancient computers like that, ancient meaning from the 1980s, those sorts of things come to mind for me. We live in a vastly different world now where those computers are basically toys, right? Not even toys. But that's where we were at that time. And for me, it's always connected with this familial memory and the chance to reminisce about my dad, who now has been gone, more than 3/4 of my life. It's a valuable opportunity for me. So I thought I would share that story with all of you.